Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I was one of the fortunate few who had the privilege of a private tour of the White House late one evening. It was past midnight, and the air outside was crisp as the tour guide led our small group through the iconic building. The grandeur of the place was as magnificent as one would expect, and each room seemed to breathe with the weight of the history it had witnessed. The opulent decor, the fine details on the walls, and the soft glow from chandeliers illuminated the halls as we walked quietly, absorbing every word the guide uttered. As we entered the East Room, the largest room in the White House, the guide began explaining the significance of the space. I was entranced by the splendor and elegance that surrounded me, and something peculiar happened. A feeling of sudden heaviness blanketed the room. It felt like the air was growing denser, almost as though the building was slowly exhaling. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one seemed to react initially. Then, from across the room, I heard it faint at first, but unmistakable footsteps. At first I thought it was one of the other guests shifting their weight, but when I looked, everyone had frozen in place, standing perfectly still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, more pronounced. The sound was clear, echoing as though someone was walking with deliberate purpose. Yet the strange thing was, no one was moving. It was as if an invisible entity had joined our tour and was walking amongst us, unseen but very much present. The guide's voice faltered for a moment before he regained his composure, trying to brush off the sound as something mundane. Perhaps the old floors settling under the weight of history. But the look in his eyes betrayed his words. He was frightened, too. The footsteps continued for a few moments longer before they suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnerving. The group stood in place, glancing nervously at one another, unsure of what to say or do. Finally, the guide cleared his throat and suggested we continue with the tour. The group hesitantly agreed, but the mood had shifted. The jovial excitement from earlier was replaced with unease, and I could feel the tension in the room. We continued through the White House, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something unseen, but watching closely. As we made our way down the long corridors, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. As we approached the Red Room, I felt a cold draft brush past me, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger with each step we took. The guide continued to speak, but his words seemed distant, like a dull hum in the background. My attention was focused elsewhere on the strange, creeping sensation that something wasn't quite right. The group entered the Red Room, a smaller, more intimate space with rich red drapes and furniture. The guide began explaining the history of the room, but my mind was elsewhere. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were louder and closer, as though someone was walking right behind me. I spun around quickly, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. My heart began to race. I wasn't the only one who heard it this time. One of the other guests, a woman standing near me, whispered nervously to her friend that she heard it too. The guide, visibly uncomfortable now, urged us to continue the tour, but I could see that he was rattled. As we walked through the remainder of the White House, the footsteps continued intermittently, always behind us, never in front. It was as if we were being followed, yet no matter how many times I turned around, there was no one there. By the time we reached the final room of the tour, my nerves were frayed. The footsteps had stopped again, but the feeling of unease lingered. As we exited the White House and stepped back into the cool night air, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted. The other guests were quiet as we said our goodbyes, and the guide quickly made his exit, eager to put distance between himself and whatever strange phenomenon we had experienced inside. The ride back to my hotel was quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, and the strange atmosphere that had descended upon the White House that night. I did some research after that experience, curious if anyone else had encountered similar events. It didn't take long to find stories of paranormal activity in the White House. Many former presidents, staff members, and guests had reported seeing apparitions, hearing disembodied voices, and, of course, the infamous footsteps. One of the most famous ghostly residents of the White House is said to be the spirit of Abraham Lincoln. Several accounts describe Lincoln's ghost wandering the halls late at night, often in the East Room, where his body lay in state after his assassination. Winston Churchill, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, and several U.S. presidents have all claimed to have seen Lincoln's spirit standing solemnly in various rooms of the White House. But Lincoln isn't the only ghost said to haunt the White House. The spirits of Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison, and even the ghost of David Burns, the man who originally owned the land on which the White House was built, are all said to make occasional appearances. The strange thing is, the footsteps I heard that night didn't match any of the descriptions I found of these famous apparitions. They weren't Lincoln's heavy, purposeful steps, nor were they the light, graceful steps of a former First Lady. These footsteps were different, slow, deliberate, and almost menacing. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was following us wanted to be heard but not seen. Weeks went by, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The memory of those footsteps haunted me, and I began to wonder if I had truly left the White House alone that night. Strange things started happening at home. Lights would flicker inexplicably, and I would hear creaking floorboards when no one was walking. At first, I brushed it off as old wiring or the house settling, but the occurrences became more frequent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow and deliberate, just like in the White House, they echoed through the hallway outside my bedroom, growing louder with each passing second. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in fear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after a few moments, the house fell silent again. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I began to wonder if I had somehow brought whatever spirit haunted the White House back with me. The occurrences at home continued for several weeks. The footsteps, the flickering lights, the eerie feeling of being watched, it was all too much to ignore. I reached out to a paranormal investigator, hoping to find some answers. The investigator conducted a thorough examination of my home and determined that there was indeed a presence there. It wasn't malevolent, but it was definitely trying to make itself known. After a cleansing ritual, the activity in my home subsided, but the experience left me shaken. I couldn't help but think back to that night in the White House, wondering what exactly I had encountered. The investigator told me that spirits often attach themselves to people who are more sensitive to their presence, and it was possible that I had unknowingly attracted the attention of one of the many ghosts that haunt the White House. To this day, I'm not sure what exactly happened that night, but one thing is certain: I will never forget the sound of those phantom footsteps echoing through the halls of one of the most famous buildings in the world. The night started like any other. I was alone at home, savoring the rare peace and quiet that came with living in a small, secluded house on the edge of town. My wife and kids were visiting relatives for the weekend, leaving me with a rare chance to enjoy some solitude. I spent the evening reading a book and watching old movies, the only sounds in the house being the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. Around midnight, as I was preparing to head to bed, I heard a soft knock at the front door. It was an odd hour for visitors, but I thought maybe it was a late-night delivery or someone who had mistakenly come to the wrong house. I approached the door with caution, peering through the peephole, but seeing nothing. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from the street lights casting faint shadows across the yard. When I opened the door, there was no one there. I frowned, puzzled, but dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. I went back inside, locking the door behind me and turning off the porch light. I was about to head upstairs when I heard the knock again. It was louder this time, more insistent. I went to the door once more, feeling a growing sense of unease. Again, there was no one there. I checked the yard, the driveway, and even looked down the street, but there was no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been some kind of prank or a trick of the wind. As I headed back inside, I noticed that the lights in the living room flickered. I turned them on and off, trying to get them to work properly, but the flickering continued. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just an electrical issue. The house was old, after all, and things like this were bound to happen from time to time. I decided to call it a night and went upstairs to bed. As I settled under the covers, I heard the sound of footsteps downstairs. They were slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking deliberately through the house. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or some other benign explanation, but the sound grew louder, more distinct, and it was definitely coming from the first floor. I crept out of bed, grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat I kept in the closet. I carefully descended the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick and oppressive. I checked each room, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed to be in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I reached the living room, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I approached, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but there was no sign of anyone. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I had a sinking feeling that I was not alone. I returned to the upstairs bedroom, but sleep eluded me. I kept hearing noises, soft whispers, faint scratching sounds as if someone was trying to get in. The next morning, I woke to find the house in disarray. Objects were scattered around the living room, and the lights were still flickering intermittently. I searched the house thoroughly, but found no signs of forced entry or anything out of the ordinary. I was on edge, feeling as though I was being watched, but I tried to brush it off as stress from lack of sleep. The doorbell rang just after breakfast. I answered it, expecting perhaps a neighbor or someone from the local community. Instead, I was greeted by a man I had never seen before. He was disheveled, with an unkempt beard and wild eyes. He introduced himself as a repairman, claiming that he had been sent to fix the electrical issues I had reported. I was taken aback. I hadn't called for any repairs, and There was no record of such a request. I told him this, but he insisted he had been sent by a company he couldn't name. He seemed nervous and kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear behind him. I refused to let him in, explaining that I would call the company myself if there was an issue. The man mumbled something about an urgent repair and left in a hurry, looking over his shoulder as he walked away. I watched him until he disappeared down the street, my unease growing. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder and closer, as though someone was walking around the upstairs hallway. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the noises were unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and bat, once more preparing to investigate. When I reached the hallway, the air was freezing cold. I could see my breath in the dim light of the flashlight. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. I searched the rooms, but found no one. Everything was in its place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As I turned to head back to the bedroom, I noticed something strange. There were fresh, muddy footprints leading from the stairs to the bedroom door. They were small, almost childlike, and they ended right outside my bedroom. My heart raced as I pushed open the door, but the room was empty. The only sound was the faintest whisper, as though someone was trying to communicate. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was lurking in the house. The noises continued intermittently, and the flickering lights seemed to grow more erratic. I spent the entire night awake, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I contacted the authorities and reported the strange occurrences. They conducted a thorough investigation, but found no evidence of an intruder or anything unusual. They suggested it might be a case of stress or paranoia, but I knew something was off. The unsettling events continued sporadically, and I was never able to find a rational explanation. The house seemed to have an oppressive atmosphere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. Eventually, I decided to move out. Unable to endure the constant unease. To this day, I avoid staying alone in unfamiliar places, haunted by the memories of that night. The uninvited guest remains a mystery, and I can't help but wonder if the strange man I encountered was somehow connected to the disturbances. The house stands empty now, a silent witness to the fear and unease that once consumed me. I moved into my new home in the suburbs at the end of summer, eager to escape the noise and chaos of city life. The house was perfect, spacious, with a large backyard, and in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. It was everything I had ever wanted. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and getting settled in. I barely saw any of my neighbors, but I figured they were just giving me space to adjust. I was grateful for the quiet, the sense of privacy. On the third day, I finally saw the couple who lived next door. They were standing in their front yard, staring at my house. It was early in the morning, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the street. The couple didn't wave or smile when they saw me. They just stood there, staring as if they were studying me. I gave them a hesitant wave, but they didn't respond. Instead, they turned and walked back into their house without a word. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just unfriendly or maybe didn't see me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that was the first sign that something was wrong. Over the next few days, I started noticing strange things about the neighborhood. The streets were always eerily quiet, even during the day. There were no children playing, no dogs barking, no cars driving by. It was as if the entire neighborhood was deserted. but it wasn't. I could see the houses well maintained, with perfectly manicured lawns and lights on in the windows at night. But I never saw any of the other neighbors, except for the couple next door. They were always in their yard, staring at my house, never speaking, just watching. It was unnerving, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself that they were just curious about the new person in the neighborhood, that they would eventually come over and introduce themselves. But they never did. One evening, about a week after I moved in, I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. I wanted to get a feel for the area, see if there were any parks or shops nearby. As I walked down the street, I noticed something odd. Every house had the same layout, the same color scheme, the same style of windows and doors. It was like they were all copies of each other, and they all had the same eerie silence. I didn't see a single person during my walk, not even through the windows. The only signs of life were the lights inside the houses flickering on as the sun set. It was unsettling, but I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe it was just a quiet neighborhood, a place where people kept to themselves. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like something was tapping against the side of my house. I froze, listening intently, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited for a few minutes, my heart pounding, but when the noise didn't return, I convinced myself it was just a tree branch or a stray animal. I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange neighbors and the unsettling quiet of the neighborhood. In the early hours of the morning, just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It sounded like something was pounding on the walls of my house, trying to get in. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the darkened houses. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to find the source of the noise. I walked around the house, shining the light on the walls, the windows, the yard, but there was nothing there. No branches, no animals, nothing that could have made that noise. I was about to go back inside when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The couple from next door was standing in their yard, staring at my house. They were perfectly still, their eyes fixed on me, their faces expressionless. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, the flashlight trembling in my hand as they stared at me with those cold and blinking eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked back into their house, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about the couple, their strange behavior, the way they always seemed to be watching me. A few days later, I decided to do some research on the neighborhood, see if I could find anything that might explain the odd behavior of the neighbors. I spent hours online searching for any information I could find, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No reports of strange occurrences. No rumors of haunted houses or cursed land. It was as if the neighborhood didn't exist before I moved in. Frustrated and more than a little creeped out, I decided to pay a visit to the local library, hoping to find some old records or archives that might give me some answers. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, seemed surprised when I asked about the neighborhood. "That's an old part of town," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Not many people move there these days. It's been quiet for years." I asked her if she knew anything about the history of the area, but she shook her head. "Not much. It's always been a quiet place, though. People keep to themselves out there. Some say it's too quiet, but I've never heard of anything strange happening. I thanked her and left the library feeling more unsettled than ever. If there was no history of anything strange in the neighborhood, then what was going on? That night, as I sat in my living room, trying to relax with a book, I heard the noise again. This time, it was coming from inside the house. I froze, my heart racing, as the sound grew louder, echoing through the empty rooms. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking on the walls, moving closer with each passing second. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly made my way through the house, my hands trembling with fear. The tapping grew louder as I approached the back door, and when I opened it, I was met with nothing but darkness. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold night air, and shined a flashlight around the yard. There was nothing there, no signs of anyone or anything that could have made the noise, but the tapping continued, louder now, coming from all around me. It was as if the very walls of the house were alive, pulsing with some unseen force. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing with fear. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped, surrounded by something I couldn't see or understand. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The house fell silent, and for a moment I dared to hope that it was over. But then I heard it, a soft whisper, coming from the darkness behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room and the flickering shadows cast by the flashlight. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, drowning out all other sounds. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the malice behind them, the sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just out of sight. I backed away, my heart pounding, until I hit the wall behind me. The whispering stopped, and for a moment the silence was deafening. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving across the wall in front of me, dark and shapeless, but unmistakably alive. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it was aware of me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted for the front door, my mind screaming at me to get out of the house, to get as far away as possible. But when I reached the door, I found it locked, the key missing from the lock. I was trapped. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and changing as it crept along the walls. I could feel its cold presence, its hunger, its desire to consume me. And then, just as it was about to reach me, the front door burst open, and I was pulled outside by a strong hand. I looked up, dazed and terrified, to see the couple from next door standing over me. They didn't speak, didn't offer any explanation. They just stared at me with those same cold, unblinking eyes. And then they turned and walked back to their house, leaving me alone on the front porch, gasping for breath. I didn't go back into the house that night. I spent the night in my car, too scared to move, too scared to think. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the neighborhood without looking back. I never saw the couple again, never heard the whispers or the tapping, but the memory of that night haunts me still, a constant reminder that some places are best left alone. I don't know what was in that house, what it wanted, or why the neighbors were so strange, but I do know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something I couldn't see or understand. And I will never, ever go back to that neighborhood. Some things are better left in the shadows. I've been a trucker for nearly 2 decades, and in that time I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on Route 66 one lonely, moonless night. I had picked up a load in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and was headed west towards Barstow, California. It was a route I knew well, one I had driven countless times before, but this time something was different. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. The sky was cloudless, yet there was no moon, no stars, just an impenetrable blanket of darkness. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, convincing myself it was just fatigue from the long hours on the road. But as I drove on, the feeling only grew stronger. The headlights of my rig barely pierced the darkness, illuminating the cracked, desolate road ahead. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the endless stretch of asphalt and the vast, empty desert on either side. I turned up the radio, hoping some music might help shake the eerie silence that surrounded me. But all I got was static, the white noise filling the cab with an unsettling hiss. I scanned through the stations, but there was nothing, not even the usual late-night talk shows or country music that kept me company on long drives. Just static. I was about to turn the radio off when I saw something in the distance, just at the edge of my headlights. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively slowed the truck, my eyes fixed on the figure ahead. As I got closer, I could make out the details. It was a woman, dressed in a long, white gown that fluttered slightly in the wind. Her hair was dark, cascading over her shoulders, and her face was obscured by the shadows. I brought the truck to a stop just a few feet away from her, the engine rumbling as I stared at her through the windshield. She didn't move, didn't react to the massive rig that had come to a halt in front of her. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I rolled down the window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. But she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. She just stood there as still as a statue, her gaze unblinking. I was torn between getting out of the truck to check on her and the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in my chest. Something about the situation felt wrong, deeply wrong, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay in the truck and keep driving. But I couldn't just leave her there in the middle of the road. What if she was hurt or lost? I finally decided to get out and see if I could help her. As I opened the door and stepped down from the cab, a cold wind whipped through the air, chilling me to the bone. The temperature had dropped sharply, the warm desert air replaced by an icy cold that seeped into my skin. I walked slowly towards the woman, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. As I got closer, I called out to her again, but she still didn't respond. It wasn't until I was just a few feet away from her that I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering a few inches above the asphalt, her gown billowing around her as if caught in a gentle breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my mind racing with disbelief. This couldn't be real. There was no way. But before I could react, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were pitch black, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around them. There was no emotion in her gaze, no recognition, just an endless, suffocating darkness that filled me with a terror I had never known before. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as she began to move towards me, her movements slow and deliberate. It was like watching a predator stalking its prey, each step measured, precise. I turned and ran back to the truck, my legs feeling like lead as I fumbled for the door handle. I could feel her behind me, the cold air growing even colder as she drew closer. I threw myself into the cab and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The headlights flickered for a moment, then roared to life, cutting through the darkness, but when I looked back at the road, she was gone. The road ahead was empty. The figure in white vanished as if she had never been there. I didn't wait to see if she would reappear. I hit the gas and sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. I drove for miles, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out behind me. It wasn't until I reached a truck stop a few hours later that I finally pulled over. I was shaking, my mind still struggling to process what had happened. I sat in the cab for a long time, the engine idling, before I finally gathered the courage to get out. The truck stop was nearly empty, just a few other rigs parked in the lot, their drivers probably asleep in their cabs. I made my way to the diner, hoping a hot cup of coffee would help calm my nerves. The place was empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter. She gave me a small smile as I sat down, but I could tell she was used to seeing exhausted truckers at all hours of the night. "Rough night?" she asked as she poured me a cup of coffee. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through me, but it did little to ease the tension in my chest. I could still see her eyes, those black, soulless eyes staring into mine. The waitress must have noticed my unease because she leaned on the counter and gave me a concerned look. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the irony of her words, but the sound caught in my throat. I shook my head, trying to push the image of the woman out of my mind. I think I did," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. The waitress raised an eyebrow, but she didn't press me for details. Instead, she gave me a sympathetic smile and topped off my coffee. "You're not the first," she said quietly, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "A lot of truckers have seen things on this stretch of road, things that don't make sense. You're not crazy, if that's what you're worried about." Her words brought a small measure of comfort, but they also raised more questions. What had I seen? Was it just a trick of the mind, a product of exhaustion and too many hours on the road? Or was there something more to it? The waitress leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's an old legend around these parts about a woman who died on Route 66 back in the 1950s. They say she was on her way to meet her fiancé when she got into a car accident. She didn't survive, and ever since, she's been seen wandering the road, looking for a ride to her final destination." I felt a shiver run down my spine as she spoke. I wanted to dismiss it as just a story, a local legend meant to spook travelers. But after what I had seen, I wasn't so sure. The waitress must have sensed my unease because she straightened up and gave me a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, hon. She doesn't harm anyone. She's just lost, looking for a way home." I nodded, but her words did little to comfort me. I finished my coffee in silence, the waitress leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I finally got back on the road, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by the soft glow of morning. But the unease lingered, a heavy weight in my chest that wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, about those black eyes staring into mine. I drove the rest of the way to Barstow in a daze, the memory of that night replaying in my mind over and over. When I finally delivered my load, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I parked the rig and sat in the cab for a long time, staring out at the bustling truck stop. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself, that I needed to talk to someone about what had happened. But who would believe me? Who would believe that I had seen a ghost on Route 66? I pulled out my phone and dialed a friend, Another trucker who had been on the road even longer than I had. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but friendly. "Hey, man, what's up?" I hesitated, not sure how to start, but finally I just blurted it out. "Have you ever seen anything strange on Route 66? There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again, his voice low and serious. "You saw her, didn't you?" My heart skipped a beat at his words. "You've seen her too." "Yeah," he said quietly, "a few years back. She was standing in the middle of the road, just like you said. Scared the hell out of me. I didn't stop, though. I just kept driving. But I've heard stories from other truckers who did. Some say she tried to get in their trucks. Others say she just stared at them, like she was looking right through them." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you think she wants?" There was another long pause before he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, man. But whatever it is, I don't think she's found it yet." His words stayed with me long after we hung up. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to that night, something I was missing. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of what had happened. I continued driving Route 66 after that, but I never saw her again. Still, every time I passed that stretch of road, I felt a chill run through me, a reminder of the night I had come face to face with something I couldn't explain. And every time I couldn't help but wonder if she was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the next trucker to cross her path. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I had been working the night shift as a security guard at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town for about 6 months. The place was as dull as it got, a massive, empty building filled with dusty crates and old machinery that hadn't been used in years. My job was simple: make rounds, check the cameras, and make sure no one was sneaking around where they shouldn't be. Nothing ever happened, and I liked it that way. The warehouse had a reputation. The locals called it the box because of its cold, lifeless appearance. It had been abandoned for years after the company that owned it went bankrupt. No one wanted to buy it, so it just sat there, gathering dust and stories about strange noises and eerie sightings. I never paid much attention to the rumors. Ghost stories were just that, stories. I was here to do a job, not chase after shadows. The night started like any other. I clocked in, grabbed my flashlight, and began my rounds. The warehouse was massive, with long, dark corridors lined with rows of crates. The air was stale, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I walked through the dimly lit halls. It was easy to get lost in your thoughts in a place like this, and most nights I found myself just going through the motions. Around midnight, I was sitting in the security office, watching the monitors, when I noticed something strange. One of the cameras showed a door in the far corner of the warehouse slowly creaking open. My first thought was that it was just the wind or a loose hinge, but there was no wind inside a sealed building like this, and the door hadn't moved in all the time I had been working here. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the door. The corridor leading to it was dark, and the light from my flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. As I got closer, I could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from behind the door. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was probably just an animal or something equally harmless. After all, what else could it be? When I reached the door, I hesitated. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me, but there was nothing. Just a small, empty room with bare concrete walls. The only thing in the room was an old wooden chair, placed squarely in the center. It was facing away from the door, and I couldn't see if there was anything or anyone sitting in it. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering as I did. The air in the room was different, colder, heavier. It felt like stepping into a different world. I walked around the chair, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I got to the other side, I saw that it was empty. Just an old, creaky chair with nothing special about it. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A soft, raspy voice whispered my name from somewhere behind me. I froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. The voice called my name again, louder this time, echoing off the bare walls. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and sprinted back to the security office. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard anything. Maybe it was just the stress of working alone in a place like this. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I had heard. I decided to check the security footage to see if the cameras had picked up anything unusual. As I rewound the tape, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Just before the door had opened, the camera had caught a shadow moving across the floor, a shadow that didn't belong to anyone or anything in the warehouse. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then vanished just as the door creaked open. I couldn't stay there any longer. I called my supervisor and told him I was feeling sick, that I needed to leave. I didn't mention what had happened, didn't tell him about the voice or the shadow. I just needed to get out of there. As I was leaving, I passed by the corridor where the door was. The door was wide open again, and the tapping sound had returned, louder and more insistent. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't want to know what was making that noise. I never went back to that warehouse. I quit the job the next day, not caring about the paycheck or the consequences. Whatever was in that building, whatever had called my name and made that shadow move, I didn't want anything to do with it. I still think about that night sometimes, about what might have happened if I had stayed or if I had opened that door one more time. But I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. Some things are better left unexplained. When I accepted the job at Riverside Hospital, I didn't know what I was getting into. It was an old building, its bricks worn and weathered from decades of use. The hospital had been around since the early 1900s and was known for treating all sorts of patients, from the mentally ill to those with tuberculosis. Over the years, countless people had passed through its doors, and as I would soon find out, not all of them had left. I was hired as a night shift nurse, filling in for someone who had left unexpectedly. The pay was decent, and I needed the money, so I didn't think twice about it. My first night was quiet, almost too quiet. The halls were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering every now and then, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I made my rounds, checking on the few patients who were still awake, administering their medication, and ensuring they were comfortable. It was just another night at work, or so I thought. It wasn't until my second week that things started to get strange. I was making my way down one of the long, narrow corridors when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the end of the hall. I turned my head, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out before me. I shook it off as a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from one of the old windows. But then it happened again and again, each time a little closer. By the end of the week, I was starting to get spooked. I would see the figure out of the corner of my eye, only for it to disappear the moment I turned to look. It was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it was becoming harder and harder to convince myself of that. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from one of the empty rooms. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the whispering stopped as soon as I did. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to start again, but the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I continued on, my nerves on edge. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran out of the hospital, eager to be away from whatever was lurking in those dark halls. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen or heard. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I needed the job. But the more time I spent in that hospital, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. The whispers became more frequent, always just on the edge of hearing, and the shadowy figure appeared more often, always just out of sight. One night, as I was making my rounds, I decided to check one of the old wings of the hospital that had been closed off for years. It was a part of the building that had once housed the most severe cases, patients who were deemed too dangerous to be in the general population. The wing was supposed to be empty, but as I walked down the corridor, I felt a chill in the air, the temperature dropping several degrees. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Something inside me was screaming not to go in, but I pushed the feeling aside and opened the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the cracked window. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and I could see the outline of old hospital beds covered in dust and cobwebs. I took a step inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the door was locked, the handle refusing to budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, but no one answered. I was trapped. Then I heard it. The whispering, louder than before, filling the room with its insidious sound. It was coming from all around me, echoing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The whispers were inside my head, filling my mind with their terrible words, and then I saw them. Figures, dark and twisted, emerging from the shadows, their faces contorted in pain and anger. They moved towards me, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nowhere to go. They surrounded me, their whispers turning into screams, their hands reaching out to grab me. I don't know how long I was in that room, but when I came to, I was lying on the floor, the door wide open. The figures were gone, the whispers silenced. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling, and ran out of the room, not stopping until I was outside the hospital. I quit the next day. I couldn't go back to that place, couldn't face whatever was lurking in those halls. I still don't know what I saw or heard, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Riverside Hospital is not just a hospital. It's a place of pain, of suffering, and something far worse. And whatever is in there, it's not finished with us yet. I always thought the stories were just that, stories. Growing up in a small town, you hear all kinds of tales about the strange things lurking in the woods. The older folks would talk about creatures that could only come out under the cover of darkness, beings with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, beasts that roam the forests just beyond the safety of the town's lights. As kids, we would share these stories around campfires, trying to scare each other with tales of the dogman, a half-man, half-beast that was said to haunt the deep woods. But none of us ever really believed it. At least I didn't, not until that night. It was late October, and the air was cold enough to see your breath. I was out with a couple of friends, Mark and Jason, on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip. We had done it 100 times before. Pack up some gear, head into the woods, pitch a tent, and spend the night telling ghost stories while drinking beer. We never expected anything more than a good time and maybe a hangover the next morning. We set up camp in a clearing about 10 miles outside of town, far enough into the woods that the lights and noise of the town wouldn't reach us, but close enough that we could hike back in the morning. The first few hours were just as you'd expect. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and started telling the usual ghost stories. The ones we'd all heard before, the ones we knew by heart. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. We were sitting around the fire, talking about nothing in particular, when we heard a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. We all went quiet, straining to hear it again. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal passing through, but then it came again, louder this time and closer. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more menacing, like something straight out of a nightmare. Jason was the first to speak. "Did you guys hear that?" "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell was that?" We all stood up, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the firelight. The growl came again, this time followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big. My heart was racing, and I could see the same fear in Mark and Jason's eyes. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. "Dogman. Maybe it's just a bear," I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. But we all knew that wasn't true. Bears don't make sounds like that, and they don't stalk people. Not like this. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. The growling had stopped, but the silence was even worse. We could hear our own breathing, the crack of twigs underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Every sound seemed amplified, like the forest itself was alive and watching us. Then we saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the darkness just beyond the edge of the firelight. They were set too high off the ground to be a normal animal, and they were staring right at us. For a moment, none of us moved. We were frozen in place, locked in a silent stare with whatever was out there. Then it stepped into the light. The stories didn't do it justice. The thing was massive, standing onto legs like a man, but with the head of a wolf. Its fur was dark and matted, and its teeth were long and sharp, glinting in the firelight. It let out a snarl that sent a shiver down my spine, a sound so deep and primal that it felt like it was vibrating through the ground. Mark was the first to react. He grabbed a burning log from the fire and waved it at the creature, trying to scare it off. "Get out of here," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear, but the dogman didn't budge. It just stood there, watching us with those glowing eyes, as if it was deciding what to do next. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how we could get out of this alive. Running didn't seem like an option. There was no way we could outrun something like that. And fighting it, that was out of the question. Jason started backing away slowly, his eyes never leaving the creature. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. But before we could do anything, the dogman let out a blood-curdling howl and lunged at us. The next few seconds were a blur of chaos and terror. I remember Mark swinging the burning log at it, trying to fend it off, but the creature was too fast. It knocked the log out of his hand and slashed at him with its claws, sending him crashing to the ground. Jason and I ran. We didn't look back, didn't stop to help Mark. We just ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against our faces. The growls and howls of the dogman echoed behind us, getting closer and closer. I didn't know if it was chasing us or if it had stayed behind with Mark, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to keep running. We eventually made it back to the road, gasping for breath, covered in cuts and bruises. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the town, where the street lights seemed to chase away the darkness that had nearly consumed us. We went to the police, told them what had happened, but they didn't believe us. They said Mark probably got attacked by a bear, that our minds were playing tricks on us in the darkness. But I knew what I saw. We both did. Mark's body was found the next day, or what was left of it. The official report said it was a bear attack, but I knew better. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me, and I hear that growl echoing in the back of my mind. The dogman is real, and it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. It started as a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the stress of everyday life and reconnect with nature. My friends and I had been planning the trip for months, and when the day finally arrived, we were all excited to hit the road. Black Hollow Forest was a remote area far from the city, known for its dense trees and pristine lakes. It was the perfect place to unwind and forget about the world for a while. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun was setting, the golden light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the ground. The forest was beautiful, almost surreal in its tranquility. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It was the kind of night that made you forget all your worries, made you feel alive. But as the night wore on, something began to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the once soothing sounds of the forest became ominous. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shrug it off as my imagination, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. We woke up to find strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, intricate patterns that seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light. My friends tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just some pranksters messing with us. But I could see the unease in their eyes as the day went on. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. No matter where we went, it felt like there were eyes on us, hidden in the shadows of the trees. We tried to stick together, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, a fear that none of us wanted to acknowledge. That night, we heard the whispers. They started out faint, just a low murmur on the edge of hearing, but they grew louder as the night went on. It was as if the forest was alive, its voice carried on the wind, speaking a language we couldn't understand. The whispers seemed to come from all around us, surrounding our campsite, closing in. One of my friends, Jake, decided he had had enough. He said it was all just a bunch of nonsense, that we were letting our imaginations get the better of us. He grabbed a flashlight and stormed off into the woods, determined to prove that there was nothing out there. We tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Jake didn't come back. We called his name, our voices echoing through the silent forest, but there was no answer. Panic set in. and we decided to go after him, splitting up to cover more ground. It was a mistake. I hadn't gone far when I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that cut through the night. It was Jake's voice, filled with a terror that I had never heard before. I ran towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I reached the clearing, there was no sign of him. Just his flashlight lying on the ground, the beam flickering weakly. I picked it up, calling out his name, but there was no response. The forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I was about to turn back when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the trees. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, a sickly yellow light that sent chills down my spine. I froze, unable to move, as the figure took a step towards me. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, held in place by some unseen force. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and bony, the skin stretched tight over its knuckles. I could see its mouth moving, whispering something I couldn't understand. The words were like poison, seeping into my mind, filling me with a cold, suffocating dread. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any more, the figure stopped. It tilted its head as if listening to something, and then it turned and vanished into the trees, as if it had never been there. The spell broke, and I stumbled back, gasping for air, my heart racing. I ran back to the campsite, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. When I got there, the others were already packing up, their faces pale with fear. They had seen something too, something they couldn't explain. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We left Black Hollow Forest at night, our weekend getaway cut short by something none of us could put into words. We never spoke about what happened, never told anyone about the whispers, the figures in the trees, or the symbols carved into the bark. But the fear stayed with us, a constant reminder of what we had seen. Years later, I heard a story about Black Hollow Forest, about how it was cursed, a place where the spirits of the dead lingered, trapped between worlds. They said the forest had a way of drawing people in, of playing with their minds, driving them mad. I don't know if it's true, and I don't want to find out, but I do know this: whatever is in Black Hollow Forest, it's something that shouldn't be disturbed. It's a place that should be left alone, forgotten, because some things are better left in the dark. The day the lockdown was announced, I didn't think much of it. It was just another inconvenience, another disruption in a year already filled with chaos. Everyone was confined to their homes, told to stay inside and wait it out. I live alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building downtown, so the prospect of being stuck there for weeks didn't exactly thrill me, but I figured I could manage. I stocked up on groceries, settled into a routine of working from home, and tried to keep my mind occupied. But as the days turned into weeks, and the isolation began to wear on me, strange things started to happen. It began with small, almost unnoticeable changes. A cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone, shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, the product of too much time alone and too little sleep. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing day. I started hearing noises at night, soft whispers, like someone was speaking just out of earshot, footsteps in the hallway outside my door, even though I knew I was the only one on my floor. Every time I checked, there was nothing there, just the empty corridor, dimly lit by the flickering fluorescent lights. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, that the whispers were the wind, the footsteps my own overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The worst of it started on the 10th night of the lockdown. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, like nothing I had ever heard before. It wasn't coming from outside, or the hallway, or even another room. It was coming from inside my apartment. My heart was pounding as I slowly sat up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The growl came again, louder this time, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. It was as if something was right beneath me, just below the surface, waiting to break through. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, the floor cold against my bare feet. The growling stopped, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I felt like I was being watched, like something was in the room with me, just out of sight. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room, but there was nothing there, just the same familiar furniture, the same empty space. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. I spent the next few nights sleeping on the couch in the living room, too afraid to go back to bed. The noises continued, scratches in the walls, soft thumps from the ceiling, the whispers that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was exhausted, but every time I tried to sleep, I was jolted awake by the feeling of something watching me. On the 15th day of the lockdown, things escalated. I had been avoiding the bedroom as much as possible, spending most of my time in the living room or the kitchen. But that night, as I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, I heard it again. The growl, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the floor or the walls or even outside the apartment. It was coming from right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't dare turn around. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel the hot breath on the back of my neck. It was as if whatever had been stalking me these past weeks was finally making its move. In a panic, I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. The apartment was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I could still hear the growling, but now it was mixed with something else, heavy, labored breathing, like something was struggling to contain its rage. I bolted from the couch and ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to get out. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side, something strong and determined to keep me inside. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. The building was empty, everyone else having fled the city at the start of the lockdown. I was alone, trapped with whatever this thing was. The growling and breathing were getting closer, and I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, like icy fingers wrapping around my neck. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I had to find a way out, or I was going to die. I ran to the window, throwing it open and looking down at the street below. 3 stories up. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but I didn't have a choice. I started to climb out, one leg over the windowsill, when I felt it. Something grabbed my ankle, yanking me back into the apartment with a force that sent me crashing to the floor. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me, that I didn't have time to recover. Whatever it was on me, pinning me to the ground, the growling filling my ears, the hot breath on my face. I thrashed and kicked, trying to free myself, but it was no use. It was too strong, too powerful. I could feel the claws digging into my skin, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was going to die, I knew it, and no one would ever know what happened to me. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The weight lifted off of me, The growling ceased, and the room was silent once again. I lay there, gasping for breath, too terrified to move. I didn't dare open my eyes, afraid of what I might see. Eventually, I managed to crawl to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. The apartment was dark and silent, the oppressive presence gone. But I knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. I didn't wait around to find out. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside, breathing in the cold night air. I didn't care about the lockdown, didn't care about the risks. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. I never went back. I left the city the next day, moving in with my parents in a different state. I never told them what happened, never told anyone. But I know the truth. I know what's out there, waiting in the shadows, biding its time. And I know that it's only a matter of time before it finds someone else. I wasn't new to the wilderness. As a seasoned park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange things out in the wild, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, just another night shift in the vast expanse of the national park. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky a deep, inky black, dotted with stars that seemed too bright for such a dark night. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind to break the silence. I was making my way down one of the less traveled trails, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, when I noticed something strange. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was dead silent. Not even the chirping of crickets or the hoot of an owl. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I continued down the trail, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't uncommon to feel like you were being observed by the wildlife, but this was different. It felt wrong, like something was out there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, lurking in the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But as the minutes ticked by, the sensation became impossible to ignore. I could feel eyes on me, cold and calculating, as if something was studying me, deciding what to do next. My hand instinctively moved to the radio on my belt. But before I could call in, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the trail, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. But as I stepped closer, I realized I was wrong. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes. Those eyes were like nothing I had ever seen before. They were large, completely black, reflecting the light like a predator's in the dark. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and menacing, like it was probing my mind, searching for something. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had never existed. I stood there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I knew I should leave, get out of there as fast as I could, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a nagging curiosity that wouldn't let go. I shined my flashlight around, searching for any sign of the figure, but the forest was empty, the trail clear. I turned to head back to my patrol truck, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low growl, coming from somewhere deep in the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. Fast and heavy panic set in, and I started running, my flashlight bobbing wildly in front of me. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I could feel the ground vibrating under my feet, as if something massive was charging through the forest, chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. I stumbled onto the main trail, my legs burning with exertion, but I didn't stop. I could still hear it behind me, the growl turning into a deep, guttural roar that echoed through the trees. I was nearly at my truck when I felt it, a sharp, cold pain in my back, like icy claws digging into my flesh. I cried out, my body jerking forward as the force of the impact knocked me off my feet. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me, but I didn't stay down. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and threw myself into the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road as fast as the truck would go. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, the lights of the building a welcome sight in the darkness. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my clothes soaked with sweat and blood. My colleagues stared at me, their faces a mix of shock and confusion, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. All I could do was collapse into a chair, my mind reeling from the terror of what I had just experienced. The following morning, I went back to the spot where it had happened, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But when I got there, the trail was empty. No sign of the figure, no evidence of the chase, not even a footprint. The only thing I found was my flashlight, lying on the ground where I had dropped it. The battery's dead. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a predator, always watching, always waiting. And though I still patrol those trails, I do so with a new sense of respect and fear for the unknown. Because out there in the darkness, there are things we're not meant to understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes those things are watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves known. It was late October when I first heard about the town of Ashwood. I was at a Halloween party, the kind where everyone dresses up in cheap costumes and drinks too much. I was talking to this guy, Ryan, someone I barely knew, when he mentioned the place. He said it in passing, like it was just another small town, but there was something in his tone that caught my attention. "You ever been to Ashwood?" he asked, taking a sip of his beer. I shook my head, curious. "It's this tiny place up in the mountains, real quiet, real isolated. But there's something off about it, you know. Like the people there they're weird. Almost like they're part of some cult or something." I laughed it off at the time, figuring he was just trying to spook me. But the name stuck with me, Ashwood. There was something about it that I couldn't shake, a nagging curiosity that wouldn't let go. So a few weeks later, I decided to check it out for myself. It was a Saturday, and I didn't have anything better to do. The drive was long and winding, taking me up into the mountains, away from the city, and into the thick forest that seemed to go on forever. I finally reached Ashwood just as the sun was setting. The town was small, barely more than a few streets and a handful of houses. There was a single gas station, a diner, and what looked like an old general store. The place was deserted, eerily quiet. like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. I parked my car near the diner and got out, stretching my legs. The air was cold and crisp, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you want to go inside and sit by a fire. As I walked down the main street, I noticed that the houses all looked the same old, weathered with peeling paint and overgrown yards. There were no lights on, no signs of life. It was as if the entire town was in hibernation. But as I passed by one of the houses, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a symbol carved into the door, a strange, twisted design that looked like a mix between a pentagram and some kind of animal. It was crude, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. I continued walking. My curiosity piqued. The diner was just ahead, the only building with any lights on. I figure it would be a good place to start. Maybe get some information about the town. As I pushed open the door, a bell jingled above me, and I was hit with the smell of stale coffee and frying grease. There were a few people sitting at the counter, all of them older, dressed in plain, worn-out clothes. They barely glanced up as I walked in. I took a seat at the counter and waited. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a cigarette hanging from her lips, came over after a few minutes. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. "Just a coffee, thanks," I reply, trying to make small talk. "I'm just passing through. Never been to Ashwood before." She gave me a strange look, like she was trying to figure out if I was joking or not. "Not many people come here," she said finally, pouring the coffee into a chipped mug. "It's not exactly a tourist spot." I nodded, taking a sip. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. "Yeah, I can see that. But I heard about this place from a friend. He said there was something different about it." The waitress didn't respond, just gave me another one of those strange looks before walking away. I sat there for a while, sipping my coffee and watching the people around me. They all seemed to be in their own little worlds, not paying any attention to me or each other. It was unsettling, to say the least. After finishing my coffee, I paid and left the diner, stepping back out into the cold night air. The streets were still empty, the town quiet as a graveyard. But as I made my way back to my car, I heard a faint sound, like chanting, coming from somewhere in the distance. It was so faint that I almost missed it, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the edge of town. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to follow the sound, but my curiosity got the better of me. I started walking towards the woods, the chanting growing louder with each step. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby from a nightmare. The trees were thick and tall, their branches intertwining above me, blocking out the moonlight. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and then, suddenly, I came to a clearing. The trees opened up, revealing a wide, open space illuminated by the flickering light of torches. There were people gathered in a circle, all of them dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden by hoods. In the center of the circle was a large stone altar, covered in symbols similar to the one I had seen on the door earlier. And on the altar there was a figure tied down, struggling against the ropes. I couldn't see the figure's face, but I could hear their muffled cries, their desperate pleas for help. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, as one of the robed figures stepped forward, holding a knife in their hand. The blade glinted in the torchlight, and I realized with horror what was about to happen. I wanted to move, to scream, to do something, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised the knife above their head, the chanting reaching a fever pitch, and then brought it down with a swift, brutal motion. The muffled cries were cut short, replaced by a sickening silence. The chanting stopped, and the robed figures all bowed their heads as if in prayer. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just stood there, watching in horror as the figure with the knife raised their head, pulling back their hood. It was the waitress from the diner. Her eyes were wide, glazed over with some kind of fervor, a twisted smile on her face. That's when I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to get the door open and jump inside. I started the engine and peeled out of there. Not daring to look back, I drove for hours, not stopping until I was miles away from Ashwood, the sun rising on the horizon. My hands were shaking, my mind still reeling from what I had seen. I didn't know what to do, who to tell. I knew no one would believe me. It would sound like the ramblings of a madman, a story too horrifying to be true. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hidden away in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world. A darkness that festers and grows, waiting for its next victim. And I know that no matter how far I run, how much I try to forget, the memory of that night will haunt me forever. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, the crumbling ruins of a world that once was. There's something about them that fascinates me, the way they hold on to the past, like echoes of lives long gone. But there was one place I always avoid, even though it was the crown jewel of urban exploration in our area, the old Blackwood Asylum. The stories that surrounded it were enough to keep even the most daring explorers at bay. Tales of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and people who went in but never came out. So naturally, I decided that's where I needed to go. I wasn't alone in my curiosity. My friend, Tom, was equally intrigued by the place, and we spent weeks planning our trip. We knew it wouldn't be easy. Blackwood was surrounded by a tall, rusted fence, and the grounds were patrolled by a security guard who took his job a little too seriously, but we were determined. We chose a night when the moon was new, plunging the world into darkness, perfect for slipping past the guard unnoticed. The moment we stepped onto the asylum grounds, a chill ran down my spine. The building loomed before us, a hulking mass of brick and broken windows, its facade cracked and peeling. It looked like it was barely holding together, as if one strong wind could bring it all crashing down. But it wasn't the building that unnerved me, it was the silence. The air was thick with it, oppressive, as though the asylum itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the first move. We found an entrance at the back of the building, a door hanging off its hinges, and slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and decay. Our flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing long, empty hallways lined with doors that led to God knows where. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent building. As we ventured deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight, and my fingers were starting to go numb. It didn't make sense outside. It had been a mild night, but in here it felt like we had stepped into a freezer. Tom noticed it too, but we didn't say anything. We just kept moving, too stubborn to admit that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. We found ourselves in what must have been the main ward, a large open space with rows of rusted bed frames, some still with tattered mattresses. The walls were covered in graffiti, layers upon layers of it. But beneath the spray paint, I could still see the remnants of something older. Words scratched into the plaster, names, dates, desperate pleas for help. The sight of it made my skin crawl. but I couldn't look away. It was then that we heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But when I looked at Tom, I saw the fear in his eyes, and I knew he had heard it too. We stood there, frozen, listening as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from all around us, a chorus of voices overlapping, merging into a single, unintelligible sound. My heart raced, and for the first time since we stepped inside, I felt a deep, primal fear. Tom grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the exit, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We both jumped, our flashlights flickering wildly as we scrambled to get out. But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed or pulled, we were trapped. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could hear my name among them, clear as day. "Michael," they hissed, the sound slithering into my ears like a snake. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty ward and those awful voices. Tom was panicking, pounding on the door, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the shadows, waiting for something, anything to emerge. And then it did. At the far end of the ward, a figure stepped into the light of my flashlight. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His clothes were filthy, tattered beyond recognition, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most, empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the light, leaving nothing behind. He stood there, watching us, his head tilted to one side as if he were curious. Then he started to move slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing through the ward. Tom screamed, a sound of pure terror that set chills down my spine. He bolted for the door again, slamming his shoulder against it with all his might. But it was no use. The figure kept coming, closer and closer, until I could see every detail of his rotting face, the way his skin hung from his bones, the dark stains that covered his clothes, and then he spoke. His voice was low, guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and with those words the whispers stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow worse. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and face whatever this thing was. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as he reached out, his fingers long and bony, and touched my chest. The moment his hand made contact, a wave of cold washed over me, so intense it felt like I had been plunged into ice water. I gasped, my breath freezing in my lungs, and for a moment I thought I was going to die right there in that forsaken place. But then he was gone, just like that, leaving me shivering and gasping for air. The door burst open, and Tom grabbed me, dragging me out of the ward and down the hall. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. We didn't speak, didn't look back, just ran as fast as we could until we were safely on the other side of the fence. We never spoke about what happened that night. I think we were both too scared to admit it was real, but I know what I saw, what I felt, and I'll never forget it. The Blackwood Asylum is a place that should be left alone, a place where the past lingers, where the dead don't rest. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some places are better left forgotten. I don't know what possessed me to take the night shift at Shadow Lake. Maybe it was the solitude, the idea of being alone with my thoughts, or maybe it was the extra pay that came with the job. Whatever it was, I never imagined that it would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. Shadow Lake wasn't much of a place, a small, secluded spot in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place people went to escape the world, to fish or camp or just sit by the water and forget about life for a while. It was peaceful during the day, almost serene, but at night, it was a different story. I had only been working there for a few weeks when it happened. My job was simple: patrol the area, make sure no one was trespassing or causing trouble, and keep an eye on the cabins that dotted the shoreline. Most nights were uneventful, the hours passing slowly as I made my rounds, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. But this night was different. It was early November, the air cold and crisp, the first hints of winter in the breeze. The lake was still the surface like glass, reflecting the full moon that hung low in the sky. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, when I heard something, a low, guttural growl, coming from the direction of the woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a coyote, or maybe a wolf. But there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl, something that sent a shiver down my spine. It was too deep, too resonant, like nothing I had ever heard before. I stopped in my tracks, listening, my heart beginning to race. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. I swung my flashlight towards the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint outline of the forest. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the night was playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring back at me from the shadows. They were large, too large for any normal animal, and they were fixed on me, and blinking, cold and calculating. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could react, the eyes disappeared, and I heard the sound of something large moving through the trees, the underbrush crunching under its weight. It was heading towards the lake, towards the cabins. I don't know what compelled me to follow it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was some deep-seated sense of duty. But whatever it was, I found myself moving towards the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and I could hear the sound of claws scraping against the ground, the unmistakable sound of something huge and powerful. I reached the edge of the woods just in time to see it, a massive, hulking figure standing on two legs, its fur matted and dark, almost black. It was easily over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, rippling muscles, its hands ending in long, razor-sharp claws. But it was its face that terrified me the most. It was like a twisted mix of man and beast, a canine snout with sharp, gleaming teeth, and those same glowing eyes staring right at me. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a silent stare, and then, without warning, it let out a blood-curdling howl, the sound echoing across the lake, sending chills down my spine. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to get out of there, to get as far away as possible. I sprinted towards the nearest cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its heavy footsteps, gaining on me with every second. I reached the cabin, throwing myself against the door, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the lock. Finally, the door gave way, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving, my mind racing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and I dared to hope that maybe I had lost it, that maybe it had decided to leave me alone. But then I heard it, the sound of something scratching against the door, something strong and determined. The door shook with the force of it, and I could hear the wood splintering under the pressure. I backed away, my eyes wide with terror, my mind desperately trying to think of a way out. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a table, and a small wood stove in the corner. There was a window on the opposite wall, but it was too small to climb through, and even if I could, there was no guarantee I'd be able to outrun whatever was out there. I was trapped. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. And then, with a deafening crash, the door splintered open, and the creature stepped inside. It ducked under the doorframe, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. I backed away, my hands trembling, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. The creature took a step towards me, its claws scraping against the wooden floor, and I could see the hunger in its eyes, the raw, animalistic desire to tear me apart. I don't know what happened next. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was sheer desperation. But I found myself grabbing the only weapon I could find, a small hatchet that was sitting by the wood stove. I swung it wildly, my eyes squeezed shut, my mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. I felt the hatchet connect with something solid, and there was a loud, guttural howl of pain. I opened my eyes just in time to see the creature stagger back, clutching its shoulder, blood dripping from the wound. It stared at me, its eyes filled with fury and hatred, and for a moment I thought it was going to attack again, but then it turned and fled, crashing through the door and disappearing into the night. I stood there, the hatchet still in my hand, my body trembling, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I didn't move for what felt like hours, my eyes fixed on the broken door, waiting for the creature to return. But it never did. When the sun finally rose, I found the courage to leave the cabin. The woods were silent, the lake calm and peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had fought off, and I knew that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross its path. I never went back to Shadow Lake after that. I quit my job the next day, packed up my things, and left town without looking back. But even now, years later, I can still hear that growl, still see those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. And I know that no matter how far I run, how much I try to forget, the memory of that night will haunt me forever. When I first moved to the small town of Ashfield, I was looking for a quiet place to start over. I'd gone through a rough patch of bad breakup, losing my job, and feeling generally lost in life. So when I found the little cabin in the woods for rent at a ridiculously low price, I didn't think twice. It was secluded, far from the hustle and bustle, just what I needed to clear my head and figure out my next steps. The cabin was old, almost ancient, with a sagging roof and creaky floors, but it had a certain charm. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush, the kind of place that made you feel miles away from civilization. The nearest neighbor was a good half-hour drive, and the town itself wasn't much closer. It was perfect. The first few weeks were blissful. I spent my days hiking the trails around the cabin, soaking in the peace and quiet, and my nights curled up by the fireplace with a good book. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched, the sensation that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I chalked it up to nerves, the remnants of stress from the life I'd left behind, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin, inspecting it. I froze, listening, my heart racing in my chest. The footsteps stopped right below my bedroom window, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I was too scared to look outside, so I stayed in bed, wide awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there was no sign of anyone. The ground was undisturbed, the leaves piled up against the cabin walls untouched. But I knew what I'd heard. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences only escalated. Doors that I was sure I had locked would be found wide open. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in the oddest places. And then there were the whispers, faint and indistinct, that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew they were there, haunting the silence of the cabin. Desperate for answers, I began asking around in town, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced anything strange near the cabin. That's when I heard the legend of the witch. According to local folklore, the cabin had once belonged to a woman named Eliza, who lived there over a century ago. She was a recluse, rarely seen in town, and rumors started to spread that she was a witch, practicing dark magic in the solitude of the woods. The townsfolk were terrified of her, and when crops failed and livestock died, they blamed Eliza. One night, a mob marched to her cabin, determined to rid the town of her evil. They dragged her out, beat her, and left her for dead in the forest. But before she died, Eliza cursed the land, vowing that anyone who lived in her cabin would suffer the same fate she did. The story was chilling, but I didn't believe in curses or witches. Still, I couldn't deny that something was wrong with the cabin. I decided to leave, pack up my things, and find somewhere else to start over. But as I prepared to go, the cabin seemed to fight back. It started with the doors slamming shut every time I tried to leave. Then the whispers grew louder, angrier, until they were a constant presence in my ears, driving me to the brink of madness. And finally, one night, the witch herself appeared. I had been lying in bed, trying to ignore the sounds around me, when I felt a cold hand on my ankle. I bolted upright, but there was no one there. The room was dark, but in the faint light from the moon, I saw her, Eliza, standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were hollow, her skin gray and withered, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She reached out to me, and I felt a cold dread wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. "You cannot leave," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "This is my home, and now it is yours," I screamed, a raw, terrified sound that echoed through the cabin. I scrambled out of bed, ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. I pounded on it, clawed at it, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The witch was right behind me, her presence a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. I could hear her breathing, feel the icy breath on the back of my neck, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door flew open, and I tumbled out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, not daring to look back. I left everything behind, the few belongings I had packed scattered on the cabin floor. I drove straight out of Ashfield, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even return to Ashfield to collect the rest of my things. The town, the cabin, it all felt like a bad dream, something I was desperate to forget. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's curse was still with me, that her cold, dead eyes were watching me even now. Wherever I went, I felt her presence, a shadow that lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. They say the cabin still stands, empty and abandoned, just as it was when I left. But I know better. The witch is still there, waiting for the next poor soul to wander into her trap, to fall victim to the curse that binds her to that place. I can only hope that no one else is foolish enough to follow in my footsteps, to awaken the darkness that sleeps in those woods, because once you do, there's no escape. I had always loved the isolation of Eagle's Howl. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was the kind of place where you could get away from the noise of life, where the only sounds were the whispering winds and the distant calls of wildlife. My family had owned a cabin there for generations, a simple, sturdy structure built from logs hewn from the surrounding forest. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the pressures of work and the demands of daily life. I'd been looking forward to my week-long retreat for months. The plan was simple: a few days of hiking, maybe some fishing in the nearby stream, and plenty of time to relax by the fire with a good book. I had packed enough supplies to last me the week: canned food, bottled water, firewood, and a few other essentials. I arrived at the cabin late on a Sunday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. I spent my mornings hiking the trails that wound through the dense forest, marveling at the beauty of the untouched wilderness. The afternoons were spent by the stream, casting a line and enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone in nature. And in the evenings, I would sit by the fire, sipping on a cup of coffee, the warmth of the flames warding off the chill of the mountain air. But by the third night, something changed. It started with a feeling, a strange sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. It was as if the air had grown heavier, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was simply not used to being so isolated, but the feeling persisted. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creak of a floorboard. I sat up, my heart beginning to race, my eyes scanning the darkness of the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light across the room, but there was nothing out of place, nothing to explain the noise. I told myself it was just the old cabin settling, the wood expanding and contracting with the change in temperature. But as I lay back down, I heard it again, louder this time, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor just outside my bedroom door. I sat up again, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with possibilities. I knew I was alone in the cabin. There was no one else for miles around. But those footsteps were real as the fear that was now gripping me. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, my hand trembling as I switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small bedroom. I swung it towards the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the doorway was empty. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire. I forced myself to get out of bed, my legs shaking as I approached the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. I slowly opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The cabin's main room was empty, the shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. But the front door, which I had locked before going to bed, was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of moonlight spilling in from outside. I moved to the door, every instinct telling me to shut it, to lock it, to barricade it with whatever I could find. But something compelled me to step outside, to see if anyone was there. The night was cold, the air biting against my skin. As I stood on the porch, the forest surrounding the cabin cloaked in darkness, I listened, straining to hear anything. But the night was silent. No footsteps, no rustling in the trees, not even the chirp of a cricket. It was as if the world had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving me alone in the void. I quickly shut the door, bolting it this time, and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for hours, my mind replaying the events of the night, trying to make sense of what I had heard. The next day, I searched the area around the cabin for any signs that someone had been there, but there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone had been near the cabin. I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that the isolation was playing tricks on me, but the uneasy feeling remained, knowing at the back of my mind. That night the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I didn't bother turning on the flashlight. I knew there was no point. Instead, I lay there, frozen with fear, listening as the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside my door. I don't know how long I lay there, my body rigid with terror, but eventually the footsteps stopped, and the cabin fell silent once more. When I finally mustered the courage to get out of bed, I found the front door ajar again, just as it had been the night before. But this time there were muddy footprints on the porch, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. The prints were large, too large to be human, and they were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were deep, as if whatever had made them was incredibly heavy, and they had an odd, almost claw-like shape. I followed them for a short distance into the woods, but they disappeared into the underbrush, leaving me with more questions than answers. By the fifth night, I was on edge, my nerves frayed from the lack of sleep and the constant fear. I had taken to keeping the hatchet by my bed just in case, but I knew it wouldn't do much good if whatever was out there decided to come inside. I was beginning to regret coming to Eagle's Hollow, beginning to wish I had stayed home where it was safe. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stop at the door. They entered the room. I could hear them, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor towards my bed. I clutched the hatchet, my knuckles white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there and wait for whatever was coming. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, gripping me with a strength that I couldn't fight. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was lie there, the cold hand tightening its grip, my mind screaming in terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The hand released me, the footsteps retreated, and the cabin fell silent once more. I lay there, trembling, my body drenched in sweat, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my things and left Eagle's Hollow. I didn't care about the week I had planned or the supplies I had brought with me. I just wanted to get as far away from that cabin as possible. I've never been back to Eagle's Hollow since that night, and I don't plan to. Whatever was there, whatever had taken up residence in that cabin, it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. I don't know if it was a spirit, a creature, or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. Some places are meant to be left alone, forgotten by time and untouched by man, and Eagle's Hollow is one of them. The day started like any other, with the early morning sunlight filtering through the trees and the sound of birdsong in the air. I was about halfway through my shift as a park ranger, patrolling the vast expanse of woodland that I had come to know as well as my own backyard. The forest was my second home, a place where I felt at peace, surrounded by the quiet majesty of nature. But on that particular day, something was different. It was subtle at first, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the fact that I hadn't slept well the night before, but as the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger, an unease that settled in my gut and refused to leave. The forest, normally so full of life, seemed quieter than usual. The birds had stopped singing, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush was conspicuously absent. Even the wind, which usually whispered through the trees, had stilled. I radioed into the station, but there was no response. That wasn't unusual. Reception out here was spotty at best, and I figured I was just in a dead zone. Still, the silence was unnerving. I decided to head towards one of the more remote parts of the park, an area that didn't see many visitors. It was a place I usually avoided, not because it was particularly dangerous, but because it had a reputation among the rangers. Stories of strange occurrences, unsettling sightings, and people who claimed to have seen things that couldn't possibly be real. I had always dismissed the stories as just that, stories. But on that day, something drew me there. The deeper I went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The path, once clear, began to disappear, swallowed by the undergrowth until I was left pushing my way through thick brush, the branches scratching at my arms and face. I checked my map, but it was useless. I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was, but the path was gone, as if it had never existed. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, deeper into the forest. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to see if there was a reason the path had disappeared, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I was being drawn towards something that was waiting for me. Eventually I came to a clearing, a small patch of open ground surrounded by trees so tall and thick that they blocked out the sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, soft and spongy underfoot. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, half buried in the earth. It was covered in strange carvings, symbols that looked old, ancient even, but I couldn't recognize them. They were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to move if you stared at them for too long. I felt a sudden urge to touch the stone, to run my fingers over the carvings, but I resisted. That's when I heard a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the stone itself. It was deep and resonant, like the growl of a large animal, but there was something almost human about it. The sound vibrated through the ground, through my feet, up into my bones. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me shifted, like it was alive. I lost my balance and fell, my hands sinking into the moss. It was wet, almost slimy, and as I pushed myself up, I noticed that the moss wasn't just green. It was streaked with red, like it had been stained with blood. The rumbling grew louder, and the carvings on the stone began to glow, a faint, eerie light that pulsed in time with the sound. I watched, transfixed, as the light grew brighter, the patterns shifting, changing. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized that the sound wasn't just coming from the stone, it was coming from the forest itself. The trees were groaning, their trunks bending and twisting as if they were trying to pull themselves out of the ground. The branches above me shook, leaves falling like rain, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The light from the stone was almost blinding now, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. The ground was moving, rippling like water, and I could feel something rising up beneath it, something massive. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the scratches and cuts from the branches that tore at my skin. I just ran, driven by a fear that I had never felt before, a primal terror that gripped me so tightly I could barely breathe. The forest was alive with sound now, a cacophony of creaking wood, snapping branches, and that awful rumbling that seemed to follow me, growing louder with every step. The trees were closing in around me, the path disappearing completely, leaving me stumbling through the dark, lost and terrified. I could feel something behind me, something big, moving through the trees with a speed and grace that didn't seem possible. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the sound of heavy footsteps, the crack of branches, and a low growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I ran until I thought my lungs would burst, until my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The forest was quiet again, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I looked around, expecting to see the trees closing in, but I was alone. The path was back, clear and wide, leading me back to safety. The clearing, the stone, the rumbling, it was all gone, as if it had never been there, but I knew it had. I could still feel the cold, wet moss on my hands, the sting of the scratches on my arms. I could still hear the rumbling in my ears, the low growl that had followed me through the forest. I made my way back to the station, shaken and exhausted. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But I knew I would never go back to that part of the forest again. There was something there, something old and powerful, something that didn't want to be disturbed. The forest is still my home, but I'm more careful now. I stick to the well-worn paths, and I always keep an eye on the trees, watching, waiting, because I know that somewhere out there, in the dark, something is watching me too. It was supposed to be an easy job. The security company had contracted me to watch over an old factory that was slated for demolition in a few weeks. The building had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the outskirts of the city, but recent interest in the land meant they needed someone to keep an eye on it, mainly to deter vandals and trespassers. The pay was decent, and I figure it would be a quiet gig, maybe even a little boring. I had no idea what I was signing up for. The factory was massive, a sprawling complex of rusted steel and crumbling concrete. It had been a textile plant once, employing hundreds of workers, but it had shut down decades ago, leaving the machinery to rot and the walls to peel. Nature had started to reclaim the building, with vines creeping through broken windows and moss growing in the damp corners. It was eerie in the daylight, but at night it became something else entirely, a dark, hulking beast of a place that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. My first night on the job, I parked my car just outside the main entrance and made my way inside. The company had set up a small security station near the front of the building, a portable cabin with a few monitors linked to security cameras positioned throughout the factory. I settled in, checking the feeds, but there wasn't much to see, just empty hallways, dusty rooms, and long-forgotten machinery. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. I did my rounds, walking through the cold, empty corridors, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The place was a labyrinth, with narrow hallways that twisted and turned, leading to rooms filled with rusted machines and stacks of old wooden pallets. It was easy to get lost if you weren't paying attention, but I had the layout memorized. After a few passes, around midnight, I returned to the security station, grabbed a cup of coffee from the thermos I had brought, and settled in to watch the monitors again. That's when I saw a flicker of movement on one of the screens. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, but then it happened again, a shadow moving in the corner of the frame. I leaned in closer, trying to make out what it was. The camera was positioned in one of the old loading bays a large, empty space with a few rusted shipping containers stacked against the far wall. The shadow moved again, slipping between the containers, and then disappeared from view. I felt a chill run down my spine. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the building, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the batteries in my radio, and headed out to investigate. The factory was dead silent. As I made my way to the loading bay, the only sound the soft crunch of my boots on the concrete floor. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rusted metal and flaking paint, but there was no sign of movement, no hint that anyone had been there. When I reached the loading bay, I found it empty, just as I had left it. The containers were there, covered in a thick layer of dust, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had disturbed them. I walked around the area, shining my light into the dark corners, but there was nothing, just the cold, empty space and the quiet hum of the wind outside. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me, convincing myself that it had just been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something outside. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft, shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart racing, and slowly turned back towards the containers. The sound came again, louder this time, coming from behind one of the larger containers. I gripped my flashlight tighter and approached, every nerve in my body on edge. When I rounded the corner of the container, I nearly dropped the flashlight. Lying on the floor was an old, worn-out doll, its clothes tattered and its face cracked and dirty. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and abandoned, like everything else in the factory. But what caught my attention was the fact that the doll was wet, as if it had been left out in the rain, even though the factory had been dry as a bone. I stared at the doll for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could process it, the lights in the loading bay flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight was the only source of light, its beam suddenly feeling weak and inadequate in the vast, dark space. I backed away from the container, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I had been in the dark before, but this was different. The darkness here felt oppressive, heavy, as if it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. And in that darkness, I could hear something else, the soft, almost inaudible sound of breathing. Close to close, I swung the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing, just the empty space and the shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I wanted to run, to get out of that place, and never come back, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, unable to move. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that fills your ears and drowns out everything else. And then, from behind me, I heard a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing, the kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, nothing that could have made that sound. But I could feel it, something watching me, something waiting in the darkness. Just out of sight, I stumbled backwards, my mind racing with fear, and then, without warning, the lights flickered back on, flooding the loading bay with harsh, fluorescent light. I blinked, momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness, and when my vision cleared, I found myself alone in the loading bay, the doll still lying on the floor, the silence pressing in on me. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making, not caring about anything but getting out of that factory. I reached the security station in record time, slammed the door behind me, and collapsed into the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the monitors, half expecting to see something, anything, but the screens were empty, showing only the still, silent factory. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation and the darkness getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something in that factory, something that didn't want me there. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed in the security station, too scared to leave, watching the monitors and jumping at every little sound. But the factory remained silent. The only movement, the occasional flicker of the old, malfunctioning cameras. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, not daring to look back at the factory. I never returned to that job, never set foot in that building again. I told the company I wasn't feeling well and couldn't continue, and they found someone else to replace me. I don't know what happened to them, and I don't want to know. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard in that factory. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else, something darker. All I know is that there are places in this world that are better left alone, places where the past lingers waiting for someone to disturb it. And the abandoned factory at the edge of the city is one of those places. It was just supposed to be another night on the job. As an Uber driver, I was used to all kinds of passengers, from the rowdy late-night partygoers to the quiet loners just trying to get home. But this ride was different. It started like any other. I had just dropped off a group of friends in the city and was about to head back home when I got a ping for a pickup in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I hesitated for a moment, considering just calling it a night, that the lower of one last fare was too tempting. I accepted the ride and made my way to the location. The street was dark and eerily quiet, with most of the houses looking like they hadn't seen a soul in years. As I pulled up to the address, I noticed something strange. There were no lights on in the house, no sign of anyone waiting for me. I checked the app to make sure I was in the right place, and sure enough, I was. I figured the passenger must be waiting inside to avoid the chill, so I sent a message letting them know I had arrived. A moment later, the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was tall and slender, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to swallow her whole. Her hair was dark and hung loosely around her pale face, which was almost ghostly white under the dim street lights. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, almost gliding towards the car rather than walking. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine as she got closer. Something about her just felt off. When she reached the car, she paused for a moment, staring at me through the passenger side window. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something unsettling about the way she looked at me, like she was peering straight into my soul. After what felt like an eternity, she opened the door and slipped into the back seat. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound cheerful, but my voice came out more shaky than I had intended. She didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I glanced at the app to check the destination, a place on the outskirts of the city, a good 20 minutes away. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The ride was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as we passed under the trees. The woman didn't say a word, didn't move, didn't even seem to blink. She just sat there, staring ahead with those cold, dark eyes. I tried to make small talk, asking her how her night was going, but she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. I finally gave up, focusing on the road and hoping the ride would be over soon. As we drove, the streets grew darker, the houses more spaced out, until we were driving through a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. The trees loom over us like twisted, skeletal fingers blocking out the moonlight and casting long, eerie shadows across the road. I felt a growing sense of dread, like something was watching us from the darkness. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her tone calm and detached, as if she were asking about the weather. I swallowed hard, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "I'm not sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why do you ask?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring out the window. "They say this road is haunted," she finally said, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "Many people have died here in accidents, murders. They never left." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I knew the road had a reputation, but I had never given it much thought. It was just a road after all. But the way she said it, with such conviction, made my skin crawl. We continued driving in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel my heart racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to take on a sinister quality, like the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. Then, without warning, the car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. My heart skipped a beat as the car slowed to a stop, the lights dimming until we were plunged into darkness. I tried turning the key, but the engine just clicked, refusing to start. Panic set in as I realized we were stranded on this dark, lonely road in the middle of nowhere. I turned to the woman, intending to apologize for the inconvenience, but the words caught in my throat. She was staring at me, her dark eyes wide, almost frantic, and there was something in her expression that sent a jolt of fear through me. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. Now, I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my phone, intending to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I looked around, trying to figure out what to do, when I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a shadow moving in the trees behind us. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it again, a dark shape shifting in the shadows. Coming closer, I felt a surge of adrenaline and threw open the car door. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. But when I turned around, the woman was gone. The back seat was empty, the door still closed. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I spun around, searching the darkness for any sign of her, but she was nowhere to be found. It was like she had vanished into thin air. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away from the car, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice coming from the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably her voice, calling to me, beckoning me to come closer. I knew I should run, but something compelled me to move forward, to step into the shadows. But as I walked into the darkness, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all around me. The trees seemed to close in, the air growing colder with every step. I felt like I was being drawn into a nightmare, unable to escape, unable to wake up. And then I saw a figure standing in the shadows, just at the edge of my vision. It was her, the woman from the car, but something was different. Her face was twisted, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She reached out to me, her fingers long and bony, and I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my wrist. I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron, dragging me deeper into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, the voices merging into a deafening roar that filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. I was consumed by fear, unable to think, unable to move as she pulled me closer, her face inches from mine. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The whispering ceased, the darkness lifted, and I was alone, standing in the middle of the road, the car behind me. I looked around, my heart still racing, but there was no sign of her, no sign of anything. The forest was silent, the road empty. I stumbled back to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life on the first try, the headlights cutting through the darkness as if nothing had happened. I didn't question it. I just floored the gas and sped away, not daring to look back. I never saw the woman again. I don't know who she was or what happened that night, but I'll never forget the terror I felt, the sense that something beyond my understanding had reached out and touched me. Since then, I've avoided that road, and I've stopped driving Uber at night. Some things are better left alone, and I've learned my lesson. I grew up hearing stories about the old hacienda on the outskirts of town, a crumbling relic of a bygone era, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Locals said it was cursed, that the land itself had been tainted by something evil, something that refused to die. Most people avoided the place, steering clear of the overgrown road that led to it. But I was always curious. I wanted to know what was so terrifying about a bunch of old bricks and rotting wood. I was 23 when I finally decided to check it out for myself. My friends thought I was crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see it with my own eyes. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and set out one evening just before dusk. The road to the hacienda was little more than a dirt track, winding through fields that had long since gone to seed. As I walked, the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the ground. The air grew cooler, and a heavy, oppressive silence settled over everything. When I finally saw the hacienda, it was exactly as I had imagined, an imposing structure, 3 stories tall, with crumbling walls and a roof that sagged in the middle. The windows were broken, the wooden shutters hanging by a thread, and the front door, which had once been grand and imposing, was barely hanging on its hinges. The place looked like it had been abandoned for 100 years, maybe more. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. I wandered through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the past. There was a grand staircase in the center of the house, leading up to the 2nd and 3rd floors, but the steps were rotted and unstable. I decided to stick to the ground floor, not wanting to risk falling through. The more I explored, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me, and I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the creaking of the old house settling, or the rustle of the wind through the broken windows. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed it off as nerves, telling myself that I was just letting the stories get to me. But then I found the mirror. It was in what had once been the dining room, propped up against the wall, covered in dust and grime. It was large, ornate, with a gold frame that had tarnished over the years. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I knelt down and wiped away the dust with my sleeve, revealing a surface that was surprisingly intact, despite its age. As I looked into the mirror, I saw something move behind me, a flicker of shadow, there and then gone. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, lit only by the beam of my flashlight. I turned back to the mirror, and That's when I saw it, my reflection, staring back at me with eyes that weren't my own. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The face in the mirror was mine, but twisted, wrong. The eyes were black, soulless, and the mouth was curved into a smile that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something, and I fell to the floor, the flashlight skittering across the room. The light went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I finally found it and turned it back on, the mirror was empty, just a reflection of the room behind me. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. It clung to me, a cold, clammy sensation that seeped into my bones. I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making, just wanting to put as much distance between myself and that cursed mirror as possible. I reached the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked on the handle, but it was like the door was stuck fast. I was trapped, panic set in, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned back, looking for another way out, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from the mirror was standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. It was me, but not me, a twisted, malevolent version of myself, with those same black eyes and that horrible, twisted smile. I backed away, but the figure started to descend the stairs, slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving mine. I bolted for the back of the house, crashing through doorways and skidding around corners, looking for an exit. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and slow, like they were taking their time, savoring the chase. I found a door leading to the backyard and flung it open, not caring where it led, just needing to get out of that house. I burst into the night air, the cool breeze hitting my face like a splash of water. I didn't stop running until I was back on the road, the hacienda far behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. When I finally made it back to town, I collapsed on the steps of the church, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stories had gotten into my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. The old hacienda is cursed, just like the stories said. I saw something that night, something that wasn't meant to be seen, and I don't think it's done with me yet. I haven't been back since, and I never will, but I can still feel it, watching, waiting, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see those black eyes staring back at me, that twisted smile that I know isn't mine. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I had always been a night owl, which made working the graveyard shift at the old textile factory bearable. The factory had been around for nearly a century, producing everything from garments to linens, and it had seen better days. The machines were ancient, the floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were thick with layers of dust and grime that no amount of cleaning could remove. But the pay was good, and the solitude of working late at night suited me just fine. Or so I thought. It was a typical Friday night, and I had just settled into my routine. My job was simple: keep an eye on the machines, make sure nothing went wrong, and do a bit of maintenance when needed. The factory was huge, with rows upon rows of old looms and sewing machines stretching as far as the eye could see. During the day, the place was a hive of activity with workers bustling about, but at night it was a different story. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak or groan of the aging building. I was about halfway through my shift when I first noticed it, a faint sound, just on the edge of hearing. At first I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows, but as I listened closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It sounded like ... whispering. Soft, indistinct voices coming from somewhere deep within the factory. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination or the acoustics of the old building. But the sound persisted. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding me, filling the empty space with a sense of unease. I turned up the volume on my radio, hoping to drown it out, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to get my attention. My heart began to race, and I found myself glancing around nervously, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the factory was empty, just me and the machines. Still, the whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct until I could almost make out the words. It was like a chorus of voices overlapping and merging into a single, disjointed message that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I checked the machines, but they were all functioning perfectly, their steady hum almost comforting in the otherwise eerie silence. But the whispering wouldn't stop. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the factory, near the old storage rooms that hadn't been used in years. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way through the factory, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. As I got closer to the storage rooms, the whispering grew louder, more distinct, until it was almost deafening. My pulse quickened, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow as I reached the door to the storage room. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave the factory and never return. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the factory, and the air was thick with dust. Old crates and boxes were piled haphazardly around the room, some of them dating back decades. The whispering was louder now, almost like a chant, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper within the room. I moved slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space. As I rounded a corner, I saw it, a large, old wooden crate, partially open, with something inside. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, and shined the light into the crate. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside the crate were old, tattered pieces of fabric, covered in dust and grime. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was the faces, dozens of faces, sewn into the fabric, their eyes wide open, staring at me. The mouths were twisted into silent screams, and the stitching was crude, almost barbaric, as if someone had tried to fuse the fabric and flesh together. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and the whispering reached a fever pitch, the voices screaming in my ears. I could feel something behind me, something cold and malevolent, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, not daring to look back, the whispering following me, chasing me through the factory. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart racing. The whispering had stopped, but the memory of those faces, those lifeless, tormented faces, was burned into my mind. I never went back to that factory. I quit the next day, unable to explain what I had seen, unwilling to even try. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night I would dream of that room, that crate, those faces, and in the darkness I would hear the whispering, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear, all I could think about. I don't know what happened in that factory, what kind of horrors took place in those walls. But I do know one thing. Some things are better left forgotten. Some places should remain abandoned, their secrets buried with them, because sometimes those secrets have a way of coming back, of finding you, no matter how far you run. I had always considered myself a nature enthusiast, drawn to the rugged beauty of remote places. So when my friends suggested a hiking trip through Cabrillo Canyon, I jumped at the chance. The canyon was known for its stunning views and challenging trails, but it also had a darker reputation. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but we were young and eager for adventure, dismissing the stories as nothing more than campfire tales. We set out early one morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the jagged peaks. The trail started out easy enough, winding through lush vegetation and alongside a crystal-clear stream. The further we went, however, the more difficult the terrain became. The path narrowed, the vegetation thickened, and the canyon walls rose steeply on either side, casting long shadows that made the air feel cooler, even in the midday sun. By the time we reached the halfway point, we were exhausted. We decided to take a break in a small clearing where the ground leveled out and we could catch our breath. As we rested, we noticed something strange. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush. The only sound was the wind whistling through the canyon like a mournful cry. It was eerie, but we chalked it up to our nerves and continued on our way. The trail grew more treacherous as we climbed higher, the path barely discernible among the rocks and tangled roots. The canyon walls closed in around us, and the sky above was reduced to a narrow strip of blue. I started to feel uneasy, like we were being watched, but every time I looked around, there was nothing there, just the empty trail behind us and the sheer cliffs on either side. Then we reached the cave. It wasn't marked on any of the maps we had, but there it was, a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by overgrown vines. Something about it drew us in, a strange compulsion to see what lay inside. We argued about whether to explore it, but in the end, curiosity won out. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the cave, the light from the entrance quickly fading behind us as we descended into the darkness. The air inside was cool and damp, with a faint, musty odor that made me think of forgotten places untouched by time. The walls were rough and jagged, the floor uneven and slick with moisture. We moved slowly, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. As we went deeper, the tunnel began to narrow, forcing us to crouch as we continued forward. That's when we heard the sound of something moving in the darkness ahead. We stopped, straining to hear over the sound of our own breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, a shuffling noise, like something dragging itself across the ground. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, but another part, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged me to keep going. We pressed on, the tunnel growing narrower and more claustrophobic with each step. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then, without warning, the tunnel opened up into a large cavern, and we froze at the sight before us. In the center of the cavern was a large circular pit, surrounded by strange markings carved into the rock. The shuffling sound was coming from the pit, but we couldn't see what was making it. We approached cautiously, our flashlights trembling in our hands. As we reached the edge of the pit, we shone our lights down into the darkness, and what we saw made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the pit were dozens of bones, human bones, scattered in a haphazard pile. Some were old, bleach-white by time, while others looked disturbingly fresh. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing among the bones was a figure, hunched and emaciated, with skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. We stood there, frozen in terror, as the figure slowly turned its head to look up at us. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and I could feel a cold, creeping dread seeping into my bones. Then the figure let out a low, guttural moan and began to crawl up the sides of the pit, its bony fingers scrabbling at the rock as it climbed toward us. That was all it took. We turned and ran, scrambling back through the tunnel as fast as we could. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing down like a weight. I could hear the creature behind us, its claws scraping against the stone, and I knew it was getting closer. We burst out of the cave, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until we were back on the main trail. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that cave as possible. We didn't speak much after that. The rest of the hike was a blur, a desperate race to get back to civilization. When we finally reached the trailhead, it was nearly dark, and we were too exhausted to do anything but collapse in the dirt. We never talked about what happened in that cave. It was like some unspoken agreement, a pact to leave it behind and never speak of it again, but I can't forget. I can still hear the sound of those claws scraping against the rock, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I see those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. Cabrillo Canyon isn't just a place. It's a living, breathing entity, and it doesn't like to be disturbed. I learned that the hard way, and I'll never make that mistake again. The first time I set foot in Crestwood High School at night, it was to fulfill a dare. The school had been abandoned for over a decade, left to decay in a forgotten part of town. The bricks were crumbling, windows shattered, and the roof sagged in places. Rumors had circulated for years about why the school closed down, whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and the tragic death of a student in the gymnasium. I had just started my freshman year at a nearby school, and my older brother, Danny, had dared me to spend a night in the old building. "If you make it till morning, I'll do your homework for a month," he said with a smirk. My friends thought it was a bad idea, but I didn't want to back down. I had something to prove, mostly to myself. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a backpack filled with snacks, I arrived at Crestwood High around 9 p.m. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the full moon cast eerie shadows across the dilapidated building. As I approached the front entrance, the wind picked up, rustling the overgrown weeds and sending a chill down my spine. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The musty smell of mold and decay hit me immediately, and I covered my nose with the sleeve of my hoodie. The hallways were dark, the floors littered with debris, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dust particles that hung in the air like tiny specters. I decided to make my way to the gymnasium first, the site of the supposed tragedy. The journey through the school was unnerving, to say the least. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows made me jump. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the gym, the large double doors were slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing them open. The room was massive, with a high ceiling and rows of bleachers that loomed like ancient ruins in the dark. The moonlight streamed in through the shattered skylights, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. I had heard the story 100 times how a student named Rachel had died during a basketball game, collapsing on the court for no apparent reason. Some said it was a heart attack, others believed she had been cursed, but the truth was never officially revealed. The school closed down shortly after, and the town slowly forgot about it. As I stood in the middle of the gym, I suddenly felt a cold breeze, even though there were no open windows nearby. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like the bouncing of a basketball. The sound echoed through the gym, and I turned, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The light landed on something in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I squinted, I realized it was a figure person, standing still, watching me. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of fear. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old gym uniform. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring. And then, as if on cue, the sound of the basketball grew louder, closer. I looked down and saw a ball rolling toward me slowly, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. It stopped right at my feet. Without thinking, I picked up the ball. The moment I did, the figure vanished, and the gym was plunged into an even deeper silence. My hands were trembling as I dropped the ball, and it bounced once before rolling back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where it went. I turned and bolted out of the gym, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As I ran through the school, trying to find my way out, the building seemed to change. Hallways that should have led to the exit now twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Doors that had been open were now locked, and every corner I turned brought me face to face with dead ends. Panic set in, and I began to feel like I was trapped in a maze with no way out. The whispers started then, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the shadows that danced just out of reach of my flashlight. The voices overlapped, a cacophony of murmurs that I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, vengeful. I kept running, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to find the exit. The school felt alive, like it was watching me, toying with me. Every turn I took seemed to lead me deeper into the heart of the building, further away from safety. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear, drowning out even the sound of my own footsteps. Finally, I saw at the front entrance, the door I had come through just a few hours earlier. I sprinted toward it, the whispers now a deafening roar in my ears. I could feel something behind me, something dark and malevolent, closing in on me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling out into the night. The cool air hit me like a slap in the face, and the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I collapsed on the ground, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. When I finally looked back at the school, it was just as I had found it, a decaying, abandoned building, silent and still. But I knew what I had experienced was real. I had felt the presence of something in there, something that didn't want me to leave. I never spoke about that night to anyone. Not even Danny. The memories of those whispers, that figure in the gym, still haunt me. Crestwood High may be abandoned, but it's far from empty. Something lingers in those halls, something that's been waiting for a long time. And if you're ever foolish enough to step inside, you might not be as lucky as I was. It was a late Friday night when my friends and I decided to do something we had never done before: explore the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for decades, ever since a fire had gutted the east wing and left several patients unaccounted for. The local kids told stories about it being haunted, but none of us really believed in ghosts. We were just looking for a thrill, a way to kick off the weekend with something more exciting than the usual hangout spots. We met up at the edge of the woods that bordered the asylum grounds. The building was barely visible through the trees, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The path leading to it was overgrown and forgotten, as if nature itself was trying to hide the place from curious eyes. We brought flashlights and a couple of beers, laughing and joking to keep our nerves in check as we made our way through the underbrush. As we approached the asylum, the laughter died down. The place was more imposing up close, with its tall, broken windows and crumbling brick walls. There was an eerie silence around it, no sounds of night creatures, no wind rustling the leaves, just a heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. We hesitated for a moment, but then someone cracked a joke, and we all forced ourselves to laugh. Pushing forward, the front door was still intact, though the wood was warped and rotting. It creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. The smell hit us first, a mix of mildew, old wood, and something else, something that made me think of a long-abandoned basement. We switched on our flashlights and stepped inside, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and scattered debris. The place was a maze of hallways and rooms, some of them still partially furnished with rusted beds and empty shelves. Graffiti covered the walls, left behind by other explorers who had dared to enter before us. We wandered through the first floor, peeking into rooms and calling out to each other whenever we found something interesting: a broken wheelchair, a pile of old medical records, a disintegrating straitjacket. It was creepy, but we were having fun, our initial fear giving way to curiosity. It was when we reached the second floor that things started to feel off. The air was colder up there, and the silence was more oppressive. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and every sound seemed to echo too loudly, as if the building was amplifying our presence. We found an old patient chart lying on the floor, the ink faded but still legible. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Reese, admitted in 1952 for severe hysteria. There were notes about treatments, most of which I didn't understand, but the last entry caught my eye. Patient transferred to East Wing. The East Wing was the part of the building that had burned down. I glanced at my friends, but none of them seemed to notice the significance. We continued exploring, our voices quieter now, as if we were subconsciously aware that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like there were eyes on me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the empty hallway stretching out behind us. Then we heard the nose. It was faint at first, a distant thudding sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We all stopped, our flashlights darting around the hallway, but there was nothing to see. The sound came again, louder this time, and we realized it was coming from above us. The third floor. We exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado from earlier completely gone. Someone suggested we leave, but curiosity got the better of us. We had come this far, turning back now would feel like admitting we were scared. We climbed the stairs to the third floor, the old wood groaning under our weight. The air was colder up there, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly, a reminder of the fire that had ravaged the building all those years ago. The hallway was darker, the windows here boarded up or broken, letting in only slivers of moonlight. We moved slowly, our footsteps cautious. As we followed the sound at the end of the hallway, we found the source of the noise, a large metal door, dented and rusted, with a heavy padlock hanging from it. The door was shaking, vibrating with a rhythmic thudding, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. We stood there, frozen in place, as the door rattled violently, the sound echoing through the hallway like a death knell. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy weight pressing down on us. We backed away slowly, not daring to take our eyes off the door, afraid that whatever was behind it would burst through at any moment. One of my friends whispered that we should leave, but before we could turn around, the door creaked open, just a crack, and the smell hit us burnt flesh and something sickly sweet. We didn't wait to see what was inside. We ran, tripping over debris and each other as we scrambled back down the stairs. The building seemed to come alive around us, the walls closing in, the air growing thick with smoke. I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate, as if something was following, getting closer with each passing second. We burst out of the front door, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until we were back in the woods, the asylum a dark silhouette behind us. None of us spoke on the way back to the car. There was nothing to say. We had seen something we couldn't explain, and the terror of it clung to us like a second skin. We never went back to the asylum. In fact, we never talked about that night again. But every now and then I'll have a nightmare, a dark hallway, a rattling door, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment I'll feel like I'm back in that place, with the smell of burnt flesh in the air and the sound of footsteps behind me. Cabrillo Canyon is more than just a legend. It's a place where the past and the present blur, where the dead don't rest, and where the living aren't always safe. We went there looking for a thrill, but what we found was something much darker, something that still haunts me to this day. The first time I heard about the old factory on the outskirts of town, it was just a story, a rumor spread by kids who had nothing better to do. The factory had been shut down for years, left to rot after a series of unexplained accidents claimed the lives of several workers. They said it was cursed, that something evil lingered in the shadows of the abandoned building, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. I never believed in ghosts or curses. To me, it was just another creepy tale to scare the gullible. But that changed one cold October night, when I found myself standing outside the factory, shivering not just from the chill in the air, but from the sense of dread that settled in my gut. It started innocently enough. My friend Mike and I were out driving, looking for something to do. We passed the factory, its looming silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. Mike, ever the thrill-seeker, suggested we go inside. "Come on, man," he urged, grinning. "It'll be fun. Just a quick look around. What's the worst that could happen?" I hesitated, the stories playing in the back of my mind, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed, and we parked the car a short distance away, making our way to the rusted gates that hung precariously on their hinges. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. We stepped inside, our footsteps crunching on the gravel, the cold air biting at our skin. The factory loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark, tempy eyes staring down at us. We approached the entrance, a massive steel door that was slightly ajar. Mike shoved it open, and it groaned in protest, revealing a cavernous space beyond. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of rust and decay. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the long-abandoned machinery that stood like skeletal remains of a once thriving operation. We ventured deeper into the factory, the silence almost oppressive. Every sound we made seemed to be swallowed up by the building, leaving only the faint echoes to remind us that we weren't alone. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. but it clung to me like a second skin. As we explored, Mike pointed out various things: the old conveyor belts, the rusted metal drums, the remnants of what looked like an office in the corner. But my attention was elsewhere, drawn to a large, dark stain on the floor near one of the machines. It was old, barely visible, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. "Hey, check this out," Mike called, breaking my trance. He was standing by a large metal door, partially open. "Looks like there's more back here." I joined him, peering into the darkness beyond the door. The air was colder here, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. Reluctantly, I followed Mike inside, the door creaking shut behind us. We found ourselves in what looked like a storage area, filled with old crates and metal shelving units. The air was damp, the walls slick with condensation. As we moved further in, I noticed something strange: scratches on the floor, leading from the back of the room toward us, as if something had been dragged. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing at the marks. Mike frowned, leaning down to get a closer look. "Yeah, that's weird," he muttered. "Probably just an animal or something." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. We continued to explore, but the further we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. It was like there were eyes on us, lurking in the shadows, unseen but ever present. Then we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct, echoing off the walls. It wasn't just one voice, but many overlapping, creating a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. "Mike, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I hear it." The whispers seemed to come from all around us, growing in intensity. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to get out of that place. But when I turned to go, the door we had come through was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, cold and unyielding. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the room seemed to close in on us, the walls pressing closer and closer. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and I could feel a presence, something malevolent, lurking just out of sight. We backed away, trying to find another exit, but every door we tried was locked, every hallway a dead end. The factory was a maze, and we were hopelessly lost within it. The whispers followed us, taunting, mocking, growing more frantic with each passing second. And then we saw it, a figure, just a shadow at first, but it solidified as it approached. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken and hollow. He wore the tattered remnants of a work uniform, stained with something dark, but it was his expression that froze me in place, an expression of pure hatred. Mike screamed, and the figure lunged at him, moving with unnatural speed. I tried to pull Mike away, but it was too late. The figure grabbed him, dragging him into the shadows. Mike's screams echoed through the factory, filled with terror and pain, and then silence. I was alone, my heart racing, my mind numb with fear. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the factory wouldn't let me go. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away from whatever had taken Mike. I don't know how long I ran, or how I finally found my way out. One moment I was lost in the maze of the factory, and the next I was outside, gasping for air, the cold night air filling my lungs. The factory loomed behind me, silent and still, but I knew better. I never told anyone what happened that night. The police searched for Mike, but they never found him. I tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, that I had imagined it, but deep down I knew the truth. The factory wasn't just abandoned. It was alive, a predator that lured in the curious and the foolish, trapping them within its walls. And once it had you, it never let go. I moved away from that town, started a new life, but the memories of that night still haunt me. Sometimes I can still hear the whispers, soft and distant, reminding me that the factory is still there, waiting for its next victim. I started my nursing career at St. Vincent's Hospital, a century-old institution that was known for its outdated equipment and creepy corridors. But it wasn't the run-down building that made my nights long and sleepless. It was the stories that circulated among the staff, tales of a nurse who had died tragically and still roamed the halls. They called her Nurse Emily. According to the story, she had worked at the hospital during the 1950s. She was young, passionate about her job, and loved by both patients and staff. But one night, during a particularly grueling shift, something went horribly wrong. A patient under her care died unexpectedly, and despite the fact that it wasn't her fault, the guilt consumed her. She ended her life in one of the patient rooms, unable to bear the weight of her perceived failure. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the other nurses swore that Nurse Emily still haunted the hospital. They said you could hear her footsteps in the empty hallways at night, the sound of her humming as she checked on patients who no longer existed. Some even claim to have seen her shadowy figure in an old-fashioned uniform, her eyes filled with sorrow. It was my third week on the night shift when I experienced something I couldn't explain. I was assigned to the East Wing, the oldest part of the hospital, where most of the rooms were no longer in use. The lights flickered constantly, and the heating system clanked and groaned as if it was about to give up at any moment. I was making my rounds, checking on the few patients we had in that wing, when I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of humming. At first I thought it was one of the patients, maybe someone having trouble sleeping. But as I walked down the hallway, the humming grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, the melody unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the last room on the left, room 113. It was one of the rooms that was supposed to be empty. The door closed and the lights off. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, listening to the soft humming on the other side. Every instinct told me to turn around and walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window that overlooked the parking lot. The bed was made, the sheets pristine, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, but there was no one there. The humming had stopped the moment I opened the door, leaving the room in an eerie silence. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for something to happen. But the room remained still, as if whatever had been there was now gone. I closed the door quickly, my hands trembling, and hurried back to the nurse's station. I didn't mention what I had heard to anyone. I didn't want to be the new nurse who bought into the ghost stories, but that wasn't the last time I heard the humming. Over the next few weeks, it happened again and again, always on the night shift, always in the East Wing, and always leading me back to room 113. Sometimes I would hear it when I was alone in the hallway, the sound drifting from behind closed doors. Other times, it would start when I was already in the room, the voice soft and mournful, as if someone was singing a lullaby to a child that no longer existed. I started to dread my shifts, the anxiety gnawing at me from the moment I stepped into the hospital. I wasn't sleeping well, the nightmares keeping me awake, and when I did manage to close my eyes, I would dream of Nurse Emily, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her voice humming that same haunting tune. One night I decided to confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. I brought a small tape recorder with me, determined to capture the sound of the humming, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. My hands were shaking as I made my rounds, the recorder tucked into my pocket, the red light blinking softly. The hospital was quieter than usual, the hallways empty. The only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I reached the east wing and paused, listening, waiting. The humming started almost immediately, a soft, melodic tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pulled out the recorder and pressed the button. Holding it up as I walked down the hallway, the sound grew louder as I approached room 113, the familiar dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I reached the door and stopped, my heart pounding in my ears. I pressed the recorder closer to the door, my hand trembling, and then I heard its footsteps, soft and shuffling, coming from inside the room. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned the doorknob, pushing the door open just a crack. The humming stopped abruptly, the silence deafening. I peered into the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and froze. There, standing by the bed, was a figure, a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her back to me, her head bowed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed with fear. The woman turned slowly, her movements deliberate and slow, as if she were underwater. When she finally faced me, I saw her eyes empty, hollow, filled with an endless sorrow that sent chills down my spine. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just a gaping void where her voice should have been. The room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of despair that was almost tangible. I backed away, my hand still clutching the recorder, the red light blinking in the darkness. The woman took a step towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural, and I stumbled, nearly dropping the recorder. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The figure vanished, the room returning to its normal state, the coldness lifting, leaving me standing there, alone and shaking. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallway, the recorder still clutched tightly in my hand. I left the hospital that night and never returned. I couldn't bring myself to walk those halls again, to face whatever it was that I had seen. I moved to a different city, took a job at a different hospital, but the memories stayed with me, haunting my dreams, my waking hours. I never listened to the tape. I couldn't bear to hear that humming again, to relive the terror of that night. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone in my apartment, I think I can still hear it, the soft, mournful tune, drifting through the walls, reminding me of the nurse who never left St. Vincent's Hospital. They say that Nurse Emily is still there, still watching over her patients, still haunted by the guilt that drove her to take her own life. And sometimes I wonder if she's watching me, too, waiting for the day when I'll return to those halls and face her once again.